It was late September when I decided to go camping by myself in the northern wilderness. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to turn vibrant shades of orange and red. I had planned the trip meticulously, checking weather forecasts, packing enough supplies, and ensuring my map and compass were ready. I had always found a strange kind of peace in the solitude of nature. Something about being surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the occasional sound of a bird or rustling leaves brought me a sense of clarity. The location I picked was about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. From there, it was another 4 miles of hiking to reach a secluded spot by a small, crystal-clear lake. It wasn't a place you'd stumble upon casually. I had found it years ago while on a group hike, but this was the first time I'd returned alone. The idea of disconnecting from the world, even for a weekend, seemed like exactly what I needed. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-morning, my car the only one in the gravel lot. That was reassuring. The fewer people around, the better. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through dense woods. The canopy above filtered the sunlight, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I took my time, savoring the sights and sounds of the forest. The only noises were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I remembered. The water was so clear that I could see the pebbles at the bottom, and the surrounding trees reflected perfectly on its surface. I picked a flat spot near the shore to set up my tent. The process was second nature by now. I pitched the tent, secured it with stakes, and set up my sleeping bag and small camping stove inside. I collected some firewood for later and laid out my food supplies, mostly dried meals and snacks. By late afternoon, I had everything in place. I sat by the edge of the lake, watching the sunlight dance on the water. There was a slight breeze, enough to rustle the leaves but not strong enough to be unsettling. I skipped stones across the surface and watched as small ripples disturbed the stillness. The solitude was perfect. As evening approached, I lit a fire. The warmth and flickering light created a cozy atmosphere against the encroaching darkness. I cooked a simple meal and ate while listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets had started their nightly chorus, and the occasional rustle in the bushes reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. Small animals, most likely. I wasn't worried. This wasn't bear country, and I had stored my food securely. Night fell quickly. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and without it, the darkness felt almost tangible. My fire was the only source of light, casting long, shifting shadows among the trees. I stared into the flames, letting my mind wander. That's when I first noticed it. A sound that didn't fit. It wasn't the wind or the usual rustling of leaves. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder over time. A steady crunching like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other nocturnal animal, but the sound didn't stop. It circled my campsite, always staying just out of the firelight. I tried to pinpoint its location, but it seemed to move unpredictably. My heart started to race. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods, sweeping the beam back and forth. The light revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth. No glowing eyes, no shapes, nothing out of the ordinary. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. The sound had stopped, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the solitude was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to call it a night and retreated into my tent. I zipped it up tightly and settled into my sleeping bag, my flashlight within arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise outside seemed amplified. The wind brushing against the tent fabric, the distant hoot of an owl, even the occasional plop of a fish jumping in the lake. It all felt ominous. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening intently, Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, ears straining. Then I heard it again, the crunching of leaves. This time it was closer, much closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my flashlight. I debated whether to unzip the tent and look outside. Part of me didn't want to know what was out there. Finally, I mustered the courage. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the night, illuminating the trees and bushes. Again, nothing. The sound had stopped the moment I moved. I sat there for a few moments, my breath visible in the cold night air, before zipping the tent back up. I told myself it was just an animal. That was the only logical explanation. The rest of the night was uneventful, though I barely slept. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the tent, I felt a wave of relief. I stepped outside and surveyed the campsite. Everything was as I had left it. No signs of disturbance, no tracks, nothing out of the ordinary. I tried to shake off the lingering unease as I went about my morning routine. I made coffee, packed up my tent, and prepared for the hike back to the trailhead. The hike back felt different. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt oppressive. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to focus on the path ahead, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the sensation didn't go away. About halfway back to the car, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. On the side of the trail, just barely visible among the leaves, was a footprint. It was human, unmistakably so, and fresh. The tread pattern was clear, the edges sharp. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. Who could have left it? I scanned the area, my eyes darting from tree to tree. Nothing moved. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. I stood there for a moment, debating what to do. Turning back wasn't an option. The only way out was forward. I quickened my pace, my eyes constantly scanning the trail and the woods around me. The remaining miles felt like they took forever. Every step was accompanied by the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there, just as I had left it. I threw my gear into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The drive home was quiet. I replayed the events of the trip in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it really was just my imagination, a combination of isolation and overactive nerves. But that footprint, that was real. Someone or something had been out there with me. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of that night. The sound of footsteps circling my campsite, the feeling of being watched, and that solitary footprint on the trail. This made me think twice about camping alone. The wilderness may be beautiful, but it's also vast, unpredictable, and, at times, unnervingly silent. Sometimes, it's what you don't see that stays with you the longest. I should have trusted my gut the moment I pulled into the trailhead parking lot. The gravel crunched under my tires, and my car was the only one there. It felt off like the start of a bad movie, but I'd spent weeks planning this solo camping trip, an escape from work stress and constant noise. I told myself it was normal for a weekday in the off-season. I'd have the trail to myself. That sounded perfect at the time. The air was crisp, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the forest. My pack felt heavy but manageable as I hoisted it onto my shoulders. I'd chosen a lesser-known trail to avoid crowds, a 10-mile trek to a remote campsite by a small lake. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me and nature. As I started hiking, the trees closed in around me, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves. Every step I took was accompanied by the crunching sound of those leaves underfoot. The first few miles passed uneventfully. The trail markers were faded but still visible, and I followed them closely. Occasionally, I'd stop to sip water or adjust my pack, listening to the quiet. It wasn't silent, exactly. There were the distant calls of birds and the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush, but it felt isolated. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. Around the 5-mile mark, I noticed something strange. A single boot print in the mud. It looked fresh, maybe a few hours old. At first, I was relieved. Someone else had been here recently. But as I studied it, a weird feeling settled in my chest. The print was large, bigger than my own, and it was the only one. No trail of prints leading forward or backward. Just one right in the middle of the path. I glanced around, but the forest was still and empty. It unnerved me, but I pushed the thought aside and kept walking. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was beginning to set. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky. I found a flat spot near the shore and set up my tent, taking my time to make sure everything was secure. I gathered some firewood from the nearby trees, breaking sticks over my knee and piling them up. When the fire was finally crackling, I felt a little better. The warmth and light were comforting, even as the surrounding forest grew darker. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove and ate in silence, staring into the flames. The solitude was starting to feel less like a gift and more like a weight. The trees seemed closer now, their shadows long and twisting. Every so often, I thought I heard something beyond the firelight. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, but I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was just animals. That's what forests are full of, right? When I finally crawled into my tent, I was exhausted but restless. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the darkness pressed against the thin fabric of my tent. I lay there listening. My sleeping bag felt suffocating, and every little sound outside seemed amplified. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was safe, alone but safe. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was silent, too silent. My heart was pounding, and I realized I was holding my breath. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the leaves just outside my tent. My mouth went dry. I lay frozen, listening as the steps circled my campsite. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't call out, just kept walking, circling. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. When I turned it on, the beam illuminated the tent walls, casting shadows. The footsteps stopped. My heart was racing so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, holding the flashlight, listening. But the footsteps didn't start again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal and forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found the prints. Human footprints, large and unmistakable, circling my campsite. They were pressed deep into the soil, some overlapping. Whoever had made them had walked around and around my tent while I was inside. My stomach turned as I stared at them. This wasn't normal. This wasn't okay. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. The peaceful camping trip I'd imagined was gone. All I wanted now was to get back to my car and leave. The trail felt different on the way back, darker somehow. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me cold. Hanging from a tree branch over the trail was a small bundle of sticks and twine, tied together in a crude human-like shape. It was dangling at eye level, swaying gently in the breeze. My breath caught in my throat. This hadn't been here yesterday. Someone had put it there, and recently. My first thought was to take it down, but something about it felt wrong, like touching it would make things worse. I stepped around it carefully and kept walking, my pace quickening. The rest of the hike was a blur. My legs burned, and my pack felt twice as heavy, but I didn't stop. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, I nearly cried with relief. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack into the back seat and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees and onto the road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I'm certain of one thing. I wasn't alone, and I'll never go camping by myself again. The air was crisp and cold when I stepped out of my car at the trailhead. I had planned this camping trip for weeks, eager to escape the monotony of work and city life. The forest stretched endlessly in front of me, thick with towering pines and a scattering of bare branches from deciduous trees. I hoisted my backpack, double-checked my gear, and set off down the narrow trail. The first few miles were serene. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and birds chirping. The crunch of my boots on the dirt path was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. My pack was heavy, but I had packed meticulously. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, food, water, a knife, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. As the trail wound deeper into the forest, the sunlight grew dimmer, filtered through the thick canopy above. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was low on the horizon. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. The spot was isolated, exactly what I was looking for. I set up my tent quickly, the practiced motions comforting in their familiarity. Once the tent was up, I gathered wood for a fire. The chill in the air was sharper now, and the warmth of a fire was welcome. As the fire crackled, I sat back and ate a simple meal of jerky and nuts. The stars began to appear overhead, brilliant against the inky sky. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. I felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that only comes from being far removed from the chaos of modern life. I didn't sleep well that night. The cold seeped through my sleeping bag despite its rating, and the forest's noises, which had been comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent, but when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing but silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore the area. After a quick breakfast, I packed a day bag with water and snacks and set off along a less traveled trail I had noticed near the campsite. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the kind that doesn't see much foot traffic. It felt like I was the only person who had walked it in years. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became. The air was colder here, and the light struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. There was an eerie stillness, as if the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped several times to listen, but the only sounds were my own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. After a few hours, I came across an old, abandoned cabin. It was small, with a sagging roof and walls that looked like they might collapse at any moment. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The door was ajar, creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, The cabin was dark and musty. Broken furniture was scattered about, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clear no one had been here in a long time. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There were scratches on the inside of the door, deep and jagged, as if someone or something had tried desperately to claw their way out. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was probably from an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, but the thought didn't bring much comfort. I decided it was time to head back to camp. The hike back felt longer, and the forest seemed even quieter than before. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I built a fire, more for the sense of security it gave me than for warmth. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since finding the cabin. That night was worse than the first. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or the random noises of the forest. This was deliberate, like footsteps circling my campsite. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for my flashlight and knife, my only sources of defense. I waited, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine my flashlight outside. The beam of light revealed nothing but the trees and the dying embers of my fire. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the knife, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I found footprints around my campsite. They were human, but larger than any I had ever seen, and the stride was strange, almost unnatural. Panic set in as I realized I wasn't alone out here. I decided to pack up and leave, cutting my trip short. The thought of staying another night was unbearable. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I quickened my pace, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. The trail seemed different, as if the forest had shifted overnight. Trees I didn't recognize loomed on either side, and I started to doubt my sense of direction. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was a welcome sight. I threw my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I drove home in silence, the events of the past 2 days replaying in my mind. I still don't know what I encountered out there, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain: the forest is not as empty as it seems, and some places are better left unexplored. Camping had always been my way of escaping the noise of everyday life. This time, I chose a remote spot near the mountains, a place I had read about in a hiking forum. It promised solitude, surrounded by towering pines and a clear, icy river that cut through the valley. It sounded perfect. I packed my gear meticulously, ensuring I had everything: food, water, a sturdy tent, and a map. I even bought a new knife just in case. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful but long, the kind of drive where the road narrows and cell phone signal disappears. When I arrived, I noticed my car was the only one in the gravel parking lot. A good sign, I thought. I shouldered my backpack and set off, following the trail marked on my map. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. The trail was steeper than I anticipated. It zigzagged up the mountainside, and my legs burned with each step. After hours of hiking, I reached a flat clearing overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking. Below, the river glittered in the sunlight, and the forest stretched endlessly. This would be my campsite. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was flat and dry. After setting up camp, I explored the area. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely penetrates, creating a perpetual twilight. I found a small stream not far from my campsite, perfect for refilling my water bottles. Everything seemed ideal. As night fell, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. Occasionally, I'd hear the snap of a twig or the distant hoot of an owl, but otherwise, it was just me and the crackling fire. I tried to relax, telling myself this was the peace I had been seeking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. Being alone in the wilderness can play tricks on your mind. I forced myself to focus on the fire and the stars overhead, which were brilliant in the absence of city lights. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily. The forest seemed alive with noises. I heard rustling outside my tent, soft but deliberate. Could have been an animal, I reasoned. Maybe a raccoon or a deer. Still, I gripped my knife tightly under my sleeping bag. The noises continued for what felt like hours before fading away. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the fabric of my tent. The next day, I decided to explore further. I followed the river upstream, marveling at how untouched everything felt. The only signs of life were the occasional animal tracks and bird calls. After a couple of hours, I came across something unexpected. An old cabin, half hidden by the forest. It looked abandoned, its wooden walls weathered and roof sagging. Curious, I approached cautiously. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp wood. There wasn't much left. A broken chair, a rusted stove, and a few scattered tools. On the floor, I noticed strange markings, like someone had carved symbols into the wooden planks. They didn't look like anything I recognized. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided it was best to leave. The rest of the day was uneventful. I returned to my campsite and spent the afternoon fishing in the river, catching a few small trout. By evening, I felt more at ease. Whatever unease I had felt earlier seemed to fade with the daylight. But that night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder and closer. It wasn't just rustling. I heard distinct footsteps circling my tent. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves. My heart pounded as I held my knife tightly, straining to hear more. Whoever or whatever was out there stayed just out of sight. I considered shouting but decided against it. Instead, I stayed silent, hoping they or it would go away. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping my knife in hand and my ears alert. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent cautiously and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but the ground outside my tent was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my campsite. My stomach churned. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the trailhead felt much longer than the hike in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there, just as I had left it. I threw my gear in the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But there was nothing. The experience stayed with me long after I returned home. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the cabin, and the unsettling noises. Who had been out there with me? Why were they watching me? I never found answers, and I haven't been camping alone since. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea of escaping the noise of the city for a few days in the wilderness was too tempting to resist. I'd mapped out a route through a lesser-known trail in the mountains, one that promised solitude, breathtaking views, and an escape from everything that had been weighing me down. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a reliable sleeping bag, enough food to last me 4 days, and all the survival essentials. I'd done solo trips before, so I wasn't worried. This wasn't my first rodeo. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected. Narrow, winding roads cut through dense forests, and the late autumn sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. By the time I arrived, it was already mid-afternoon. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and double-checked my map. The trail stretched out before me, a narrow path covered in fallen leaves, the trees on either side towering like silent sentinels. The first day was uneventful. The trail was well-marked, the weather crisp and cool. I walked at a steady pace, stopping occasionally to take in the scenery. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I found a small clearing near a stream and set up camp. The routine of pitching the tent and starting a small fire felt comforting, almost meditative. I cooked a simple meal, ate it while staring at the flames, and then crawled into my tent, falling asleep to the sound of the stream. The next day started off well. I broke camp early, eager to cover more ground. The trail became steeper as I ascended into higher elevations, and the views were incredible. The forest thinned out in places, revealing sweeping vistas of the valley below. I stopped for lunch on a rocky outcrop, feeling the sun warm my face as I ate. It was exactly the kind of peace I had been craving. By late afternoon, the trail began to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. The air felt cooler, and the forest grew quieter. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into the natural shift in the environment. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had started to creep in. I decided to push on a little further before setting up camp, hoping to find a more open area. That's when I saw it, a structure barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, it became clear that it was a cabin. It looked old, abandoned. The wood was weathered and dark, the roof partially caved in. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I peered inside but didn't enter. The interior was empty save for some broken furniture and a thick layer of dust. Something about the place felt off, so I decided to move on. I found a spot to camp about half a mile further down the trail. As I set up my tent, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. Who had built it? How long had it been there? Why had it been abandoned? The questions swirled in my mind as I ate dinner and prepared to settle in for the night. The forest was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of every sound. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were faint, but unmistakable, crunching softly on the forest floor outside my tent. My heart raced as I lay completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of twigs snapping, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I clicked it on and shone the beam toward the noise. Nothing. The forest was empty, or at least it appeared to be. I didn't sleep much after that. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees, set my nerves on edge. By the time dawn broke, I was already packed up and ready to move. I convinced myself that it had been an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. I'd scared it off with the flashlight, and that was that. The third day was grueling. The trail became narrower and harder to follow. Fallen trees and overgrown vegetation forced me to backtrack several times. I was making slower progress than I'd hoped, and by mid-afternoon, I realized I wouldn't make it to my planned campsite. I decided to set up camp earlier than usual, in a small clearing near the base of a rocky hill. The uneasy feeling from the night before hadn't completely left me, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the tasks at hand. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. I built a fire, its flickering light providing some comfort. I ate quickly and crawled into my tent, hoping for a better night's sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, the sound growing louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Then silence. The footsteps stopped, and the forest was still. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I emerged from my tent, exhausted and on edge. The fire had burned out, and the ground around my campsite looked undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. It didn't make sense. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. The hike back was a blur. I moved quickly, driven by a mix of fear and adrenaline. The forest seemed darker, the trees more oppressive. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, standing at the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was over, that I was safe now. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. I'd scoured online forums, looking for any information about the trail or the abandoned cabin. There were no mentions of it, no records or maps that showed it existed. The whole experience felt like a fever dream, something my mind had conjured up in the isolation of the wilderness. But deep down, I knew it had been real. The footsteps, the cabin, the feeling of being watched. I hadn't imagined any of it. I haven't been camping since. The gear I used on that trip sits untouched in my closet, a silent reminder of the forest and the unanswered questions it left me with. I've tried to move on, to forget, but some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I find myself lying awake, listening. And in those moments, I can't help but wonder, what or who was out there with me? Camping in the remote wilderness had always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. There was something about the solitude, the crisp mountain air, and the freedom from cell service that drew me in like a moth to a flame. That's why, despite the warnings about the unseasonably cold weather, I decided to pack up my gear and head out to a secluded spot deep in the woods. I chose an area I'd visited once before, years ago. It was far from any major trails, a perfect place to disconnect and reset. The spot was about a 4-hour hike from the nearest parking area, and the path was overgrown, barely a trail anymore. I liked that about it. The fewer people who knew about it, the better. The hike started out beautifully. The late autumn sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots, and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush kept me company. My pack was heavy with gear and supplies, but I felt strong and eager. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting everything in hues of orange and gold. The clearing was just as I remembered, a flat patch of ground bordered by towering pines, with a small, babbling creek running nearby. I set up my tent close to the tree line for extra shelter from the wind and gathered some stones to build a small fire ring. As I worked, the temperature began to drop sharply. By the time I had my fire going and my dinner cooking, the air was biting cold, and I could see my breath in the flickering firelight. After eating, I sat by the fire, enjoying the stillness of the night. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant against the inky blackness. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect until it wasn't. It started with a sound, faint at first but unmistakable. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the creek. I froze, straining my ears. It wasn't an animal sound, not the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was deliberate, almost mechanical, like someone striking wood against wood. I told myself it was probably just a tree branch knocking against another in the wind, though there was no wind to speak of. The sound continued, steady and unchanging, and an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on adding more wood to the fire and planning the next day's hike. But the thumping didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to be getting closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the creek, the beam cutting through the darkness. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. Still, my heart was pounding, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and went back to the fire. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I left the fire burning low and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. It took a long time for sleep to come, and when it did, it was restless. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, unsure of what had startled me. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the clearing was bathed in pale moonlight. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves were absent. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath. Then I heard it again, the thumping sound, louder this time and much closer. It was coming from just beyond the tree line, where the shadows were deepest. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was steady and deliberate, each thump sending a jolt of fear through me. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Summoning all my courage, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked outside. The clearing looked empty, but the thumping continued, relentless. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was a figure barely visible among the trees. Human-like but distorted, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching me. My mouth went dry, and my hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the woods, the thumping sound fading with it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, which I'd rekindled to full blaze, clutching a knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sunlight filtering through the trees. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. As much as I loved the solitude, this was too much. Something or someone was out there, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. I packed my gear in record time and started the long hike back to my car. The hike out was tense. Every sound made me jump, and I constantly felt like I was being followed. Several times, I stopped to listen, but all I heard was the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time I reached the parking area, I was physically and emotionally drained. As I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the driver's side window, written in the condensation, were two words, "Stay out." I didn't wait to think or investigate further. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I haven't been camping since. I never thought camping alone would test my nerves the way it did. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything, a chance to disconnect and enjoy the silence of nature. I picked a remote spot in the woods, far from the usual campgrounds, where I wouldn't see another soul for miles. That was the whole point, to be alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of the wild. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive took longer than I expected, winding through narrow dirt roads that seemed to disappear into the forest. By the time I parked my car and unloaded my gear, the sun was already low in the sky. The light filtering through the trees cast long shadows on the forest floor, making everything look slightly more sinister than I had anticipated. Still, I shrugged it off. This was what I wanted: solitude. I found a flat clearing not too far from a small stream, an ideal spot to set up camp. The ground was soft, covered with a thick layer of pine needles, and the gentle sound of running water was soothing. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and set up a small fire pit with rocks I collected nearby. Everything seemed perfect, a peaceful escape from the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire and cooked a simple dinner. The woods were alive with noises: crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was calming in a way, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone out here. I stayed by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the night. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and settled into my sleeping bag. The air was cool but not cold, and the quiet of the forest felt like a blanket wrapping around me. I drifted off to sleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The forest was still, almost too still. The usual chorus of insects and distant rustlings was absent, replaced by an unnerving silence. I lay there, listening, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, straining my ears to catch any other noise. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced with possibilities. A deer? A raccoon? Maybe even a bear? But the steps were deliberate, not the random scuffling of an animal. I stayed still, barely breathing, as the sounds moved around the perimeter of my tent. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the small knife I had brought with me. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. After what felt like an eternity, the steps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't dare move. I lay there for hours, listening, waiting for the sounds to return. They never did. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and with it a sense of relief. The sunlight streaming through the trees made the fears of the night seem almost silly. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered from the night before. I checked the ground around my campsite and found what I had been dreading: footprints. Human footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, circling my tent and then heading off into the woods. My stomach churned as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was miles from the nearest road, in a spot that wasn't on any map. How could someone have found me out here? I decided to stay close to camp that day. The idea of hiking and exploring suddenly felt less appealing. I spent the morning gathering wood, reinforcing my fire pit, and trying to shake off the paranoia that was creeping in. By midday, I convinced myself that it was probably just another camper who had stumbled across my site and decided not to bother me. It was a comforting thought, even if it didn't entirely make sense. The day passed uneventfully. I cooked lunch, read a book I had brought with me, and tried to relax. As the sun began to set, I built up the fire again, determined to keep it burning brightly through the night. The woods were quieter than the night before, and the silence felt oppressive. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more deliberate. I could hear them crunching through the underbrush, moving closer. My hands trembled as I gripped my knife, my mind racing with fear. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. The footsteps stopped just outside the glow of my campfire. I stared into the darkness, my eyes straining to see who or what was out there. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that played tricks on my vision. I thought I saw movement, but it was impossible to tell. I shouted into the night, my voice cracking with fear. There was no response, just silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly darting to the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. The footprints were back, fresh and unmistakable. They circled my camp again and then headed off into the woods. I followed them for a short distance, curiosity getting the better of me. They led to a tree where I found something that made my blood run cold. A small, crude figure made of sticks and twine, hanging from a low branch. I didn't waste any more time. I threw my gear into the car and started the engine, the sound of it breaking the oppressive silence. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the trees, tall and indifferent. It took hours to get back to civilization, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For days after, I kept thinking about those footprints, the stick figure, and the strange silence of the woods. I still don't know who or what was out there, but one thing is certain: I won't be camping alone again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in nature, away from the noise of the city, that brings me a sense of peace. But one trip last fall changed how I feel about being alone in the woods. I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about camping again. It started as a solo weekend getaway. I had a few days off work and decided to spend them in a remote area of the Green Mountains in Vermont. The trails there were challenging, and the campsites were far apart, which meant fewer people. That's exactly what I wanted. The solitude. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water filter, and a first aid kit. I also brought my GPS, a paper map, and a good pair of hiking boots. The drive to the trailhead took about 4 hours. I parked my car in the small gravel lot, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just beginning to turn their autumn colors. It was beautiful, a postcard-perfect day. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, and I made good time. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing where I planned to set up camp. It was a small flat area with just enough space for my tent. A shallow creek ran nearby, providing a water source. I set up my tent, collected some water to filter, and sat down to enjoy a simple dinner of dehydrated chili. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the occasional rustling of leaves. The first night was uneventful. I woke up early, made coffee, and packed up my gear. My plan was to hike deeper into the forest and spend the second night at a more remote site. The trail became steeper and less defined as I went along. Fallen trees and patches of overgrowth made progress slower. I had to stop frequently to check my map and GPS to make sure I was on the right track. Around midday, I noticed the first strange thing. The forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wildlife was just further away, or perhaps I was too focused on the trail to notice. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It wasn't as open as my first campsite, but still manageable. I set up my tent under a large pine tree and gathered some wood for a small fire. As I sat by the fire, eating my dinner, I had an uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I hadn't seen a single person since I started hiking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, but then I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. Shining the light around, I didn't see anything. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside the tent, but I kept my flashlight and a small camping knife close by. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet from my tent, the ground was disturbed. It looked like someone had been standing there, pacing back and forth. The leaves were scuffed and scattered. I checked the area thoroughly but didn't find any footprints. It was unsettling, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe the wind had blown the leaves around in a weird way. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. I packed up quickly and decided to change my route. Instead of continuing deeper into the forest, I planned to loop back toward the trailhead. The idea of another night out here didn't sit well with me. The hike back was tough. The trail was steep and rocky, and I was moving faster than I should have been. I stumbled several times, scraping my hands and knees. By late afternoon, I found a small flat area to set up camp. It wasn't ideal, but I was too tired to keep going. That evening, the unease returned. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, rustling in the underbrush. Every time I turned my head, the sound stopped. I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I stayed up as long as I could, but exhaustion eventually won. I crawled into my tent and fell into a restless sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, the noise was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. I froze, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping and starting. Whoever or whatever it was, they were just outside. My mind raced. Should I call out? Stay silent? Make a run for it? I decided to stay quiet and wait. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I lay awake for hours, clutching my knife, until the first light of dawn. When I stepped out of the tent, I found more disturbed ground around my campsite. This time, there were clear boot prints. Someone had been there, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I felt a wave of panic. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching me. I packed up as quickly as I could and started hiking. I didn't stop for breaks, didn't eat, didn't even drink much water. My only goal was to get back to my car. The forest felt oppressive, the trees closing in around me. Every noise made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but I was alone. By late afternoon, I finally reached the trailhead. My car was still there, the only one in the lot. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It's been months since that trip, and I still think about it. Who was out there with me? What did they want? I'll never know. But one thing is certain. I'll never go camping alone again. had always loved camping. The sense of being away from everything, immersed in nature, was something that gave me a sense of peace. It was the kind of escape I needed to recharge, to clear my head. But this time was different. This trip was supposed to be simple, just a weekend getaway, a quiet retreat into the woods. But what happened changed my whole outlook on camping. I decided to go alone. A quiet weekend in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to relax. The place I'd picked was remote, tucked away in a dense part of the forest, miles from the nearest town. I made sure to check the weather forecast: clear skies, low chance of rain, everything looked perfect. The drive there took me almost 4 hours, a winding stretch of road that cut through dense forests and past wide open fields. As I drove, I felt that familiar excitement building up. It wasn't just the thrill of being outdoors. It was the anticipation of the quiet, the stillness that only nature could offer. No distractions, no notifications from my phone, just me and the trees. When I finally arrived, I parked the car and took in my surroundings. The forest was thick with trees, their branches intertwined like a natural roof that blocked out the sun. The campsite itself was on a small clearing, just big enough for my tent, with a fire pit in the middle. The air smelled fresh, clean, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was perfect. I spent the next hour setting up camp. I unpacked my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and got the fire pit ready. As I went about the routine of gathering firewood, I felt a strange sense of unease, but I brushed it off. It was just the isolation, the quietness, I told myself, the type of environment that made everything seem a little more intense. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I lit a fire and settled down on a log, enjoying the warmth as the air grew cooler. The forest around me seemed alive with sounds: the crackle of the fire, the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. I sat there for hours, the fire burning low, until eventually, I decided it was time to sleep. I zipped myself into the tent, listening to the quiet outside. The night seemed so still, yet somehow, everything felt different. The darkness felt heavier, like it was pressing in on me. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it lingered. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But then I heard it again. It was a steady, deliberate rustling, almost like someone was walking around the perimeter of my campsite. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or another animal, but deep down, I knew something was off. The rustling continued, and I held my breath, straining to hear every sound. It was as if whatever it was moving closer. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and, as quietly as I could, unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the edge of the campsite. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stood still for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. My stomach churned, and I instinctively stepped back into the tent, zipping it shut. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was nothing, but the unease wouldn't go away. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to every sound around me. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the silence of the night. I could feel my pulse in my throat and the cold sweat on my skin. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink, but I was too shaken to stay in the tent any longer. I decided to pack up and leave, but as I started to gather my things, I noticed something strange. The ground around my campsite was disturbed, as if someone had been walking in circles around my tent. The soil was pressed down in uneven patterns, and there were fresh footprints leading into the woods. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. The prints were large, deep, and they seemed to circle my tent, like whoever had been out there was watching me. I didn't know what to think. Who would be out here this far into the woods? And why had they been so close to my tent? The logical part of me said it was probably just another camper, someone passing by. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I hurriedly finished packing, trying not to let my mind wander too far into thoughts of what could have happened. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I loaded everything into the car, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But there was nothing. The forest was still silent. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, checking for any movement behind me. But the road remained empty, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I didn't stop until I reached the small town nearby. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I had just let my nerves get the best of me. But the footprints, the strange rustling outside my tent, that wasn't normal. And whoever had been out there knew exactly where I was. I never went back to that campsite. It took me months before I went camping again, and even then, I stayed in well-traveled areas, far away from the places that felt too isolated, too wrong. And I've never forgotten that feeling, the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching me in the darkness. It wasn't just the fear that stayed with me. It was the realization that, in the woods, no matter how safe you think you are, you're never truly alone. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. After a long week of work, I needed a break. I needed to disconnect and just be out in the woods, away from everything. No phone, no emails, no constant noise of city life. Just me and the wilderness. I packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, some canned food, and a few snacks. I had planned everything out, and I couldn't wait to get to the campsite and set up. The drive was peaceful. The early morning fog clung to the edges of the road as I made my way out of town and into the forest. I could feel my shoulders relax as the trees started to surround me, as the road got quieter, and the air began to smell more like pine and earth than exhaust fumes. I passed by a few small towns, but they quickly gave way to stretches of wilderness. There was only one road to the campground, so I didn't have to worry about getting lost. The campground wasn't too far from where I parked, and when I arrived, I found it relatively empty. It was still early, and I figured most people were either still at home or still asleep. The site I chose was in a quiet spot near the edge of the forest, right next to a small stream that bubbled gently over rocks. The sound of running water was peaceful, and the fresh air filled my lungs. I set up my tent quickly, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire to keep the chill away. I spent the afternoon by the stream, reading a book and just taking in the silence. It was one of those moments where everything felt perfect. The sun filtered through the trees, casting a dappled light across the forest floor, and the only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But as the sun started to dip below the trees, I noticed something strange. It was a sound, faint at first but distinct. A soft thud, almost like footsteps, but they weren't coming from anywhere nearby. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else setting up camp in the distance, but the campsite was still empty. I shook it off, figuring it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The woods were full of sounds. Animals, wind, branches creaking, and it wasn't uncommon to hear things that weren't immediately explainable. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I added a few more logs to the fire, hoping to keep it going long enough for me to cook a simple meal. I'd brought some prepackaged camping food and a small stove, but I was too tired to make anything complicated. The firelight flickered in the darkness, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. I was starting to feel a little uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation or the eerie quiet that had settled in around me. The sounds of the forest had become muffled, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't normal. Normally, the forest was alive at night, full of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But tonight, it felt like something was watching. I tried to ignore the sensation, telling myself that I was overthinking things. After all, I was in the woods all alone. No one was here to hurt me, and yet, as the night deepened, I kept hearing the sound again. The soft thud of footsteps, not too far away. They weren't constant, but they came and went. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was an animal or another camper nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't normal. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, my mind racing. Every so often, I would glance toward the edge of the trees, where the darkness seemed to press in tighter. There was nothing there, but the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and a branch snapped somewhere off in the distance, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. My heart raced. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the air. I reached for my flashlight, checking the time. It was already late, way later than I had planned to be awake. But sleep didn't seem like an option now. The night felt too thick, too heavy, and the noises, they just kept coming. Thud, 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 closer this time and in a pattern that was hard to ignore. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I couldn't just sit there, hoping it would go away. I grabbed my flashlight and walked cautiously toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark trees, illuminating only a few feet in front of me. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that would explain the thudding sound. But there was nothing, just the tall, silent trees, their branches swaying in the breeze. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, closer now. Thud, thud, thud. It was definitely footsteps, but they weren't the soft, quick footsteps of an animal. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Whoever or whatever it was moving through the forest just out of sight. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a long moment, I did nothing but listen. The sounds continued, moving slowly but steadily, as though they were approaching my camp. My heart pounded in my ears. I was torn between wanting to run and knowing that running would make me look like prey. I had to stay calm. I took a deep breath and turned back to the campsite, my flashlight now sweeping the trees in a more deliberate manner. I tried to move quickly but quietly, making my way back to my tent. But the moment I stepped into the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear, just a shape in the dark, but it was enough to make me freeze. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. It just stood there, almost as if it were waiting. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another camper who had gotten lost? Someone playing a prank on me? I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't react, didn't even shift. The only movement was the slight rustling of the trees in the wind. Thud, thud. The footsteps started again, but this time they were right behind me. I whirled around, shining the flashlight at the sound. There was nothing there, but the sound continued, and it was coming closer. Thud, thud, thud. It was too much. My heart was racing, my breathing shallow and rapid. I needed to get out of there. Without thinking, I grabbed my bag, threw everything into the tent, and zipped it shut. My mind was racing. I couldn't leave. I couldn't stay. I was trapped in a feeling of dread that had settled in my bones. The footsteps stopped. I sat in the tent, holding my breath. The wind seemed to die down, leaving everything in a strange silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more sounds, just the occasional rustle of the trees. Slowly, I gathered my courage. I wasn't about to sit in that tent all night, waiting for whatever it was to find me. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peeking out into the dark clearing. The figure was gone. The air felt thick, but there was no sound, no movement. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying there for another minute. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, heart still hammering in my chest, and I didn't look back. The drive home felt like the longest drive of my life, every passing shadow and curve in the road making my heart skip. By the time I reached the safety of my apartment, I could hardly believe what had happened. But the most unsettling part wasn't the figure or the footsteps. It was the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, that the woods had wanted me gone. And that was a feeling I would never forget. I didn't go camping for a long time after that night. When I did eventually return, I made sure to go with a group. But no matter where I went, I always remembered the footsteps, the silence, and the figure in the trees. And every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I wonder if I really was just imagining things, or if something out there was watching me, waiting. I never thought camping could be scary. Growing up, I'd always gone on camping trips with friends and family, enjoying the fresh air, the warmth of a campfire, and the quiet beauty of nature. There were always the usual stories shared around the fire about things that go bump in the night, animals rustling in the bushes, the occasional bear sighting. But I'd always shrugged them off. I thought they were just part of the charm of being out in the woods. But this trip was different. It was just me this time. I decided to go alone, wanting some peace and solitude. I packed light, grabbed my backpack with my tent, sleeping bag, food, and a few tools for the campfire. I headed out to a remote part of the forest I'd found through some online research. The place was supposed to be beautiful, tucked away from the usual trails, and not many people went there. It felt like the perfect place to disconnect and get away from the noise of life. The drive was smooth, winding through country roads that became narrower the deeper I went into the woods. The air grew cooler as the trees thickened around me, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me. It was peaceful, but there was something almost unnerving about how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I pulled over to the spot I'd planned to camp, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was secluded, just what I wanted. I grabbed my gear, setting up my tent quickly. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the forest took on an eerie stillness. As the sky darkened, I made a small fire. I sat by the crackling flames, listening to the sounds of the night, the snap of the firewood, the occasional whine through the trees, the distant call of an owl. It felt peaceful, like everything was in its right place. But that peace didn't last long. I first noticed it when the fire began to settle, casting long, flickering shadows around the clearing. A rustling sound came from the edge of the woods, far enough away that I figured it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. It wasn't unusual. But then the rustling grew louder and closer. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an animal looking for food. But it wasn't the typical sound of an animal in the woods. The movement was deliberate, slow, almost watching. My heart began to race, my body tensing as I kept my eyes fixed on the shadows of the trees. I scanned the area around the campfire, looking for any signs of movement. Nothing, but that feeling, the feeling that I wasn't alone, it didn't go away. I stood up, grabbing a stick from the fire and holding it out like a makeshift weapon. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't. The noise had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick. My breath felt shallow as I tried to listen carefully, my ears straining for any sound. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement, the outline of something large and dark standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human-shaped, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was watching me. I froze. The figure didn't move, just standing there in the shadows. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as I gripped the stick harder. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My mind was spinning. Was it another camper? But why were they standing so still, not saying a word? Why didn't they come closer? I felt a sudden urge to pack up and leave. But the thought of packing everything and driving out of here in the dark filled me with a new kind of dread. I didn't want to turn my back on whatever that thing was. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I stared at it, waiting for it to make a move. Seconds dragged into minutes. The figure didn't move. It was like it was waiting for me to make a decision. I was too scared to speak, too scared to move. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, aiming it toward the trees where I'd seen the figure. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the area in front of me. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, no sign that anyone had ever been standing there. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it. The figure had been right there, so clear in my mind, but now it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every crackle of the fire, every breeze through the trees made me jump. I kept my flashlight nearby, shining it into the darkness every few minutes. I didn't care how crazy it seemed. I had to be sure. No one else was around, and I was alone in the woods. My mind was playing tricks on me, right? But the next morning, the unease didn't fade. As I packed up to leave, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. A set of footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too human. And they didn't look like they had been made by someone who had walked through the area earlier. They were fresh. I wasn't the only one here. I packed up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to stay calm. I didn't know what had happened the night before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe it wasn't. But as I loaded my gear into the car, I couldn't ignore the cold chill crawling down my spine. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I didn't even think about camping again for a long time. Sometimes I still think about what I saw that night. The figure in the trees. The strange footprints. What it was, I don't know. Maybe it was just another camper, maybe it wasn't. But whatever it was, I'm glad I never found out. I decided to go camping alone. Something I'd never done before but always wanted to try. The idea of solitude appealed to me. No phones, no emails, just me and nature. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual campsites. It was a place I'd read about online, known for its serene beauty and isolation. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive to the forest took most of the day. The last stretch was on a rough dirt road that seemed barely maintained. My car bumped and jolted over the uneven surface, and I kept checking the GPS to ensure I was still heading in the right direction. Eventually, I reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. This was it, the perfect spot. I parked the car, unloaded my gear, and started setting up my tent. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. After setting up camp, I decided to explore the area before sunset. I followed a narrow trail that wound through the trees, the ground soft beneath my boots. The forest felt alive, yet peaceful. I saw a few deer grazing in a meadow and noticed the faint tracks of other animals in the dirt. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, and the temperature began to drop. I lit a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. As darkness settled in, the stars came out in full force, brighter than I'd ever seen them. It was stunning, but as the night deepened, the isolation started to feel different. The forest, so inviting during the day, now seemed vast and unknowable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made my heart race. I reminded myself that it was just wildlife. Nothing out here wanted to harm me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I forced myself to focus on the fire, its warmth and light reassuring. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire thoroughly, ensuring there were no embers left, and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and despite my earlier nerves, exhaustion soon took over. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up sometime in the early morning, startled. Something had snapped me out of sleep, but I wasn't sure what. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The crickets had stopped, and there was no wind. Just an eerie, heavy silence. My pulse quickened. Then I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow and deliberate, moving around my campsite. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too steady, too measured. It didn't feel right. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, straining to hear more. The footsteps continued, circling my tent. They'd stop for a moment, then start again, moving closer. My mind raced. Could it be another person? But who would be out here, miles from any trailhead, in the middle of the night? The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a drum. Then came a soft scraping sound, as if someone or something was brushing against the fabric of the tent. My mind went into overdrive. I reached for the small camping knife I'd kept near me, clutching it tightly. My hand trembled. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The scraping stopped, and the footsteps retreated. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Eventually, the forest noises returned. The crickets resumed their chirping, and I heard the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Whatever it was seemed to be gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife, my eyes glued to the tent walls. At first light, I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered outside. The campsite looked untouched, just as I'd left it. But when I stepped out, I noticed footprints in the dirt, human footprints. They circled my tent and led off into the forest. My stomach turned. Someone had been here. I packed up as quickly as I could, my eyes darting around the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. The serene beauty of the forest was gone, replaced by a sense of vulnerability. I'd wanted isolation, but now it felt like a trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every sound made me jump, and I constantly looked over my shoulder. When I finally reached the clearing and saw my car, relief washed over me. I loaded my gear, got in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. The drive back to civilization felt surreal. The whole experience played over and over in my mind. Who had been out there? What did they want? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. One thing's certain, I won't be camping alone again. The forest, as beautiful as it is, holds secrets I'd rather not uncover. It started out as a normal camping trip. I had planned everything down to the last detail. The weather forecast looked promising. I had all my gear packed, and the spot I'd chosen was isolated, just how I liked it. A small clearing deep in the woods, about a 2-hour hike from where I could leave my car. I wanted solitude, a break from the humdrum of daily life, and a chance to reconnect with nature. The hike to the clearing was uneventful. The trail was slightly overgrown, but I had my GPS and a detailed map of the area. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at wildlife moving about. I reached the clearing by early afternoon, set up my tent, and started gathering firewood. The spot was perfect. A flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek nearby for water, felt peaceful, almost idyllic. By evening, I had a fire crackling, a simple meal cooking, and the satisfaction of being miles away from the nearest person. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods around me grew darker and quieter. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I sat there, staring into the flames, enjoying the solitude. But as the hours passed, I began to feel off. It was a subtle thing at first, an uneasy sensation that I couldn't quite place. The forest around me seemed too quiet, as if all the nocturnal animals had decided to hold their breath. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination, and crawled into my tent for the night. I woke up suddenly sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. The faint crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Someone or something was moving out there, just beyond the light of the dying fire. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. I reached for the hatchet I'd kept inside the tent with me, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but no other sounds came. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing through. I eventually fell back asleep, though it was a restless sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Just a few feet from my tent, the ground was disturbed, scuffed up as if someone had been standing there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me while I slept. I checked the area thoroughly but found no other signs of intruders. Still, the unease lingered. I debated packing up and heading back to the car, but I'd come out here to get away, and I wasn't ready to cut the trip short. I spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The woods were dense, with thick undergrowth that made progress slow. I marked my path carefully to avoid getting lost. By the time I returned to camp, I felt a bit more at ease. The sunlight filtering through the trees had a way of making everything seem less threatening. That night, I made sure to build a larger fire and kept it well fed. I sat close to it, the warmth and light comforting against the encroaching darkness. But as the night wore on, the uneasy feeling returned. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining for any unusual sounds. It was around midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were louder, closer. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling the campsite. Whoever it was, they were staying just beyond the firelight, as if they knew exactly where the edge of the light ended. I called out, my voice shaky, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence was deafening. I sat there for hours, gripping my hatchet, staring into the darkness, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off in my chair by the fire. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. My fire had burned out completely, and the clearing felt eerily still. I checked the perimeter of my camp and found more signs of disturbance. Scuffed dirt, broken twigs, even what looked like a partial footprint. It was human, no doubt about it. I decided then and there to pack up and leave. The isolation that had once been so appealing now felt like a vulnerability. I hurriedly stuffed my gear into my backpack, doused the fire, and started back toward the trail. The hike back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me looking over my shoulder. About halfway to the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The undergrowth along the trail had been disturbed, as if someone had passed through recently. The thought that whoever had been at my campsite might be following me sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I quickened my pace, nearly jogging at times, desperate to put as much distance between me and the woods as possible. When I finally reached the parking area, I was relieved to see my car untouched. I threw my gear into the back, started the engine, and didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road. Even as I left the forest behind, the sense of unease lingered. Back home, I couldn't shake the experience. I went over the details again and again, trying to make sense of it. Who had been out there? What did they want? I considered reporting it to the authorities, but what could I say? That I'd heard footsteps and seen some scuffed up dirt? In the end, I decided to let it go. But the memory of those nights in the woods stayed with me, a reminder of how vulnerable we are when we're alone in the wilderness. I had been planning the camping trip for months. The idea was simple, a solo weekend in the woods to clear my mind. Work had been relentless, and I felt like I was suffocating in the city. I needed an escape, even if just for a few days. I chose a remote spot in a national forest about 3 hours from home. It wasn't a popular campground, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, plenty of food, water, a map, a compass, and my trusty multi-tool. I also brought a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a portable phone charger. I knew there wouldn't be any cell service, but I figured it might come in handy if my phone's GPS could still pick up a signal. The drive out was uneventful. The further I got from the city, the lighter I felt. The air smelled fresher, the sky seemed bigger, and the hum of traffic was replaced by the occasional bird call. By the time I reached the gravel road leading to the trailhead, I was smiling for the first time in weeks. I parked my car in a small, unpaved lot. There were no other vehicles, which didn't surprise me. It was early spring, and the nights could still get pretty cold. Most people wouldn't venture out here until late May or June. I double-checked my gear, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail was narrow but well-marked. It wound through dense pine forests, across a few small creeks, and eventually up into higher terrain. The scenery was stunning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. I passed patches of wildflowers just starting to bloom and stopped to watch a family of deer grazing in a meadow. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where deadlines and emails didn't exist. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached the spot I had picked out on the map. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall pines. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and the sound of the water was soothing. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground and arranged my gear inside. Then I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire. By the time the sun started to set, I was sitting by the fire with a cup of instant coffee, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of the stream and the crackling fire. I woke up once in the middle of the night, startled by a distant noise that sounded like a howl. Could have been a coyote or even just the wind. Either way, it didn't last long, and I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for a while, stopping to take pictures of the scenery. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. I noticed the small things, the way the sunlight hit the water, the intricate patterns of lichen on the rocks, the sound of birds chirping high in the trees. It was exactly what I had come here for. Around midday, I found an old, overgrown trail that wasn't on my map. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curious, I decided to follow it. The trail was rough, with fallen branches and patches of thick undergrowth, but it was clear enough to follow. It led uphill, winding through dense forest, until it reached a small ridge. From there, I had a stunning view of the valley below. I could see my campsite in the distance, a tiny speck of color in the sea of green. I sat on a rock and ate lunch, enjoying the view. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in the dirt near the edge of the ridge, partially obscured by leaves and pine needles. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, I realized they were human. Barefoot by the looks of it. The prints were wide and deep, like whoever made them was heavy. They weren't fresh. The edges were soft, and a thin layer of pine needles had settled over them, but they still made me uneasy. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived. Who would be walking around out here without shoes? I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had passed through here months ago, or even last summer. The forest had a way of preserving things longer than you'd expect. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I packed up my lunch and headed back to camp, taking a different route to avoid the old trail. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read a book by the fire, cooked a simple dinner, and went to bed early. But that night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those footprints. I kept telling myself it was silly, that there was no reason to be scared, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Around midnight, I heard something outside my tent. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on pine needles. My heart started racing. I reached for my flashlight and shined it through the thin fabric of the tent. The sound stopped. I stayed frozen, listening, but all I could hear was the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After a while, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found more footprints. These were fresh, pressed into the soft ground near the stream. They were the same as the ones I had seen on the ridge, barefoot, wide, and deep. But this time, they were close to my campsite. Too close. Whoever or whatever had made them had been here while I was sleeping. Panic started to set in. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the car. The hike back was a blur. I moved as fast as I could without running, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. But when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I didn't fully understand. I never reported what happened. What would I say? That I saw footprints in the woods? That I heard noises in the night? It all sounded so trivial, so easy to dismiss. But I know what I felt out there. I've been camping dozens of times, and I've never felt anything like that. It wasn't just fear, it was a primal, gut-deep sense of danger. I haven't been back to the woods since. Maybe someday I'll feel brave enough to try again. But for now, I'm staying close to home. I never thought camping alone would be a problem. I've always been the type of person who loved being outdoors, far from the city's constant hum. The mountains had always been my escape. They were peaceful, quiet, and made me feel small in the best way possible. I'd done solo camping trips before, so when I decided to head out for a long weekend in the woods, I didn't give it a second thought. I packed my gear, made sure I had plenty of food and water, and drove a few hours to a trailhead I'd been eyeing for months. The spot I chose wasn't exactly remote, but it wasn't crowded either. It was late autumn, and most people had already called it quits for the season. The trail was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, and the air smelled damp and earthy. The trees were mostly bare, their branches stretching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. I felt that familiar thrill of being alone with nature, and I hiked for hours without seeing a single soul. I'd planned to set up camp by a small lake I'd marked on my map. When I arrived, the water was perfectly still, reflecting the overcast sky. The surrounding area was quiet, too quiet, maybe, but I brushed off the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone, and that's what I wanted. I pitched my tent near the water, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder, and I bundled up in my jacket, enjoying the warmth of the flames. The first night was uneventful. I'd always found the sound of the forest at night to be soothing. The rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant cry of some animal. It all blended together into a kind of natural symphony. I slept well and woke up early the next morning, ready to explore the area. The second day was just as quiet as the first. I hiked around the lake, took some photos, and even tried a bit of fishing, though I didn't catch anything. By late afternoon, I decided to gather more firewood before it got dark. That's when I noticed something odd. About 50 yards from my campsite, I found what looked like the remains of another campsite. There was an old fire pit, long since abandoned, and some scattered trash, a rusted can, a torn piece of tarp, and a few other things that had clearly been there for a while. It wasn't unusual to come across old campsites, but something about this one felt off. It looked like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I tried not to think too much about it as I carried my firewood back to camp. Maybe it had been a group of teenagers or someone who'd gotten spooked by a bear. I told myself it didn't matter, but the uneasy feeling from the day before returned, stronger this time. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I'd glance over my shoulder every so often, but I never saw anything. That night, the forest felt different. The usual sounds were there, but they seemed distant, muted. The air was still, and the silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. I stayed up later than usual, staring into the fire and trying to convince myself that everything was fine. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, I felt vulnerable in a way I never had before. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the campsite. The forest was silent. I lay there for a moment, listening, and then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and close. My heart started pounding in my chest. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I've never felt fear like that before. Every muscle in my body was tense, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Was it an animal? Person? What did they want? I wanted to grab the knife I kept in my pack, but I was afraid to make any noise. I'd never felt so helpless. Whoever or whatever was out there stayed for what felt like an eternity. Then the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I cautiously unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There was no sign of anyone, but the ground around my campsite told a different story. There were footprints in the dirt, large and unmistakably human. They circled my tent and led off into the woods. My stomach churned as I followed them for a short distance. They disappeared near the old campsite I'd found the day before. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I started back down the trail, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. About an hour into my hike, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tied to a tree just off the trail was a piece of cloth, the same color and material as my tent. It hadn't been there on my way in. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone had been to my campsite while I was sleeping and taken something. They'd followed me, marked my trail. My hands were shaking as I untied the cloth and stuffed it into my pocket. I didn't want to leave any trace of myself behind. The rest of the hike was a blur. I'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and I was certain I was being watched the entire time. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine and drove away. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about what happened. I've gone over it again and again in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who was out there? What did they want? I've told myself it was probably just some weirdo trying to scare me, but the truth is, I don't know. I've always loved the woods, but now they feel different. The peace I used to find out there has been replaced by a lingering unease. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. I've always enjoyed camping. There's something about being in the middle of the woods, surrounded by the stillness of nature, that helps me clear my mind. I'd planned a weekend trip to a secluded spot I'd read about online. It wasn't a popular camping ground. No designated trails, no marked campsites, just wilderness. Perfect for someone like me who wanted to escape the noise of everyday life. I packed my gear meticulously. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, and tools. I double-checked everything, ensuring I had enough supplies for 2 days. I'd planned to hike about 6 miles into the woods to a clearing by a stream. The directions seemed straightforward. Follow the old logging road, take a left at a large oak tree with a split trunk, then continue until I reached the clearing. I'd also downloaded a map of the area just in case. The drive to the forest took a little over 2 hours. By the time I arrived, it was late morning. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and reminds you you're far from city pollution. I parked my car at the edge of the logging road, slung my pack over my shoulders, and set off. The hike started off easy. The logging road was wide and relatively flat. Leaves crunched under my boots, and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. About an hour in, I found the oak tree. It was hard to miss. The split trunk looked like a giant Y, and its size dwarfed the surrounding trees. I veered left, leaving the road behind. The trail, if you could call it that, was narrow and overgrown. Branches snagged at my sleeves, and I had to step over fallen logs and rocks. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird and the steady rhythm of my footsteps. It was peaceful, but there was an edge to it, a kind of silence that made me hyper-aware of every little sound I made. After another hour of hiking, I reached the clearing. It was just as described, a flat patch of grass surrounded by tall trees, with a stream cutting through the middle. I set my pack down and took a moment to catch my breath. The spot was perfect. The stream's gentle gurgling was the only noise, and the canopy above provided enough shade to keep things cool without blocking too much sunlight. I pitched my tent near the stream, careful to avoid the few spots where the ground seemed too damp. Setting up camp didn't take long, and soon I was sitting on a log, eating a sandwich I'd packed. The afternoon passed quickly. I spent some time exploring the area, gathering firewood, and just soaking in the solitude. By the time the sun began to set, I had a small fire going and was heating up a can of soup. Night in the woods is different. The darkness feels heavier, and the noises, or lack thereof, take on a new significance. I'd expected the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, frogs, maybe an owl. But as the hours ticked by, it was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that's unnatural. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being this far removed from civilization. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and zipped up the flap. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the stream's gurgling was the only sound. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling, trying to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My first thought was animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I listened closely, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. Another crunch, closer this time. It wasn't a steady rhythm like a four-legged animal would make. It was deliberate, slow, like footsteps. I sat up, my breathing shallow. I reached for the small flashlight I'd left by my side and clicked it on. The beam was weak, barely cutting through the tent's fabric. I debated whether to unzip the flap and look outside. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, a hunter, or someone who shouldn't be out here. I waited, flashlight in hand, listening. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I told myself to calm down. I was jumping to conclusions. Maybe it was just an animal, and I'd scared it off by moving. Eventually, I lay back down, though sleep was out of the question. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light filtered through the trees, I crawled out of the tent. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any signs of an intruder. Near the edge of the clearing, I found them. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the woods to a spot just outside my tent. And then they stopped. My stomach churned. Someone had been here, watching me. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd gotten lost and stumbled upon my camp. But why didn't they call out? Why didn't they approach? I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear quickly, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. The hike back felt longer than it had the day before. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the trunk and locked the doors the moment I got inside. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, weeks later, I still think about that night. I haven't been camping since, and I don't know if I ever will again. I've always loved camping. It's the kind of solitude that city life just doesn't offer. The crisp air, the quiet of the forest, the distant rustling of leaves. All of it made me feel alive. But after what happened last summer, I haven't been able to set foot in the woods again. It started as a solo trip. I'd done plenty of those before without any issues. This time, I chose a remote area in the Rockies. It wasn't a well-known camping spot. More of a backcountry area where you wouldn't run into another person for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. I had a map, my gear, and 3 days of food. It was supposed to be a simple in-and-out trip. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car in a gravel pull-off, shouldered my pack, and started the hike. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with no signs of recent use. Perfect. I'd marked a clearing on my map about 7 miles in, right by a creek. That would be my campsite for the first night. The hike took longer than I expected. The trail was steeper and rockier than the topo map suggested. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The air was cooling fast, and I hurried to set up my tent. I pitched it near the creek, close enough to hear the water but far enough to avoid any surprises if it rained. Dinner was a quick affair, a dehydrated meal and a cup of tea. The stars were brilliant, and the quiet was exactly what I'd hoped for. I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted but content. I slept like a log. The next morning, I woke up to birdsong and the smell of damp earth. After breakfast, I packed up and moved deeper into the wilderness. My plan was to loop around a ridge and camp at another spot about 10 miles away. The trail became less distinct as I went, and I had to rely on my map and compass. It felt like real wilderness. No footprints, no trash, nothing but trees and rocks and sky. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small plateau with a stunning view of the valley below. I decided to take a break and have lunch. The sun was warm, and the breeze was just enough to keep the bugs away. As I ate, I noticed something odd. A faint trail leading away from the plateau, one that wasn't marked on my map. It looked like an animal path at first, but it was too wide and too even. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. The trail led downhill, winding through dense forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air felt cooler here, and the sounds of the forest seemed muted. After about half an hour, I came to a clearing. In the center was a small, dilapidated cabin. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. It looked ancient, with moss-covered shingles and a door hanging slightly ajar. There were no windows, just small openings covered with wooden shutters. I felt a sudden chill, but I told myself it was just the shade. It wasn't unusual to find old hunting cabins in the woods. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The cabin looked abandoned, but something about it felt off. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and musty, with a dirt floor and a single wooden chair tipped over in the corner. There were no signs of recent use, no food wrappers, no footprints, nothing. Still, I felt like I was intruding. I didn't stay long. I snapped a few pictures with my phone and headed back to the main trail. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was low in the sky. I set up my tent, made dinner, and tried to shake off the unease I'd felt at the cabin. It was just an old building, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest felt different, like it was watching me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone walking carefully. I held my breath, clutching my knife. The footsteps stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around my campsite. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I told myself it had to be an animal. I packed up and continued my hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The trail became more challenging as I climbed higher. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge with a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. It should have been breathtaking, but I felt uneasy. I set up my final campsite near a cluster of boulders, hoping they would provide some sense of security. As I cooked dinner, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night was worse than the last. The footsteps returned, louder and closer. I stayed awake, gripping my knife, my heart pounding in my chest. At one point, I thought I saw a figure outside my tent, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all. By dawn, I'd had enough. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. The hike down was grueling, and I felt like I was being followed the entire way. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, but the forest was silent. Too silent. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my pack in the back seat and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I don't know what I experienced out there. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was something more. All I know is that I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure if I ever will. I've always been drawn to the outdoors. Something about the solitude and the stillness of the wilderness clears my mind in a way nothing else can. Last summer, I planned a solo camping trip to a remote area in the Rockies. It was a decision I'd been mulling over for months, and once I had a long weekend off work, I packed my gear, fueled up the car, and headed out. The drive was uneventful but beautiful. As I wound through mountain roads, the air became crisper, the trees denser, and the hum of city life a distant memory. My destination was a spot I'd read about online, a secluded campsite near a lake, accessible only by a narrow trail. The reviews had mentioned its serenity and lack of foot traffic, which was exactly what I wanted. When I reached the trailhead, the parking area was empty except for my car. I loaded up my backpack, double-checked my map, and set off. The hike was challenging but manageable. The trail snaked through dense pine forests, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning views of the surrounding peaks. The further I went, the more disconnected I felt from the modern world. My phone had lost service about 10 minutes into the hike, and I'd left it in airplane mode to conserve battery for emergencies. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I reached the campsite. It was as picturesque as I'd hoped. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the surrounding mountains and the cloudless blue sky. The area was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. I chose a spot a little way back from the water, surrounded by tall pines, and began setting up my tent. The process was familiar. I'd done it countless times before, and within an hour, I had a fire pit cleared, my tent pitched, and my gear organized. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the temperature began to drop. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. There was something deeply satisfying about sitting by the fire, eating under the stars, with no sounds but the crackling wood and the occasional chirp of crickets. I stayed up longer than I'd planned, enjoying the tranquility, before finally retreating to my tent. The forest felt alive around me as I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't unsettling. It was comforting, like the earth was keeping me company. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent, eerily so. I stayed still, listening, my senses on high alert. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was distant, but unmistakable. I told myself it was probably an animal. This was their home after all. But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. My heart began to race. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The beam of light swept over the trees, illuminating nothing but trunks and shadows. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, I stayed frozen, scanning the darkness, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. Finally, convinced I was overreacting, I zipped the tent back up and lay down, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the lake's surface sparkled. I chalked up the previous night's experience to my imagination running wild and focused on enjoying the day. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The trail circled the lake and climbed a ridge that promised a panoramic view. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear a rustle in the bushes or the snap of a twig. Each time, I'd stop and look around, but I never saw anything. The forest seemed to be playing tricks on me, amplifying every sound and shadow. I forced myself to keep going, determined not to let paranoia ruin my trip. The view from the ridge was worth the unease. The lake stretched out below, surrounded by endless forest and towering peaks. I sat there for a while, eating a snack and soaking in the scenery. For the first time that day, I felt at peace. But as I began the descent back to camp, that feeling of being watched returned. It was stronger now, almost tangible. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting to every movement in the undergrowth. When I got back to camp, everything was as I'd left it. My tent was intact, my gear untouched. I built another fire, hoping its warmth and light would ease my nerves. As the sun set, I tried to convince myself that I was safe. This was the wilderness, after all. It was supposed to feel wild and unpredictable. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. That night, I was woken again. This time, the sound was closer. It wasn't just footsteps now. It was the unmistakable noise of someone, or something, moving around my campsite. I lay frozen, every muscle tense. As I listened, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, but I could hear it. The soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, the faint rustle of fabric. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A cougar? Person? Summoning all my courage, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The noise stopped instantly. I shone the light around the campsite, my hand trembling. The beam illuminated nothing unusual, just my gear, the trees, the dying fire. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ground near the fire pit, where I'd smoothed out the dirt the day before, was covered in fresh footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and they circled my tent. Panic set in. I doused the fire with water, packed up my essentials as quickly and quietly as I could, and decided to hike back to the trailhead immediately. Staying felt like a risk I wasn't willing to take. The trail was treacherous in the dark, but I had a headlamp and enough adrenaline to keep me moving. The hike back was the most harrowing experience of my life. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a threat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. Several times, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I stopped to look, there was nothing there. My heart pounded relentlessly, my breathing shallow and ragged. The forest, which had felt so inviting during the day, now felt like a predator's lair. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sight of my car was almost overwhelming. I threw my pack in the trunk, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But the road remained empty, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and my own racing thoughts. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in cell service range, that I allowed myself to relax. I pulled over and called a friend, recounting the entire experience. They suggested I report it to the local authorities, which I did. A ranger later told me that while the area was generally safe, there had been occasional reports of suspicious activity in remote campsites. They promised to check it out, but I never heard back. That trip changed the way I see the wilderness. I still love the outdoors, but I've become more cautious. I never camp alone anymore, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. You never really know what's out there or who. Camping alone had always been something I enjoyed. It gave me a sense of peace, a way to disconnect from the noise of everyday life. That's why, when I had a long weekend off work, I packed my gear and headed to a remote spot in the woods I had read about online. It was supposed to be secluded, surrounded by towering trees and bordered by a clear, quiet lake. Just what I needed. The drive there took about 3 hours, the last stretch being a bumpy dirt road barely wide enough for my car. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The site was perfect. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and the forest was dense and silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. There wasn't another soul around, just the way I liked it. I pitched my tent close to the lake and set up my small camping stove. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. After dinner, I sat by the lake, watching the colors of the sunset fade into twilight. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of insects and distant hoots of an owl. I felt a deep sense of calm. This was why I loved camping. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and nature. When it got too dark to see much, I retreated to my tent and fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. It was the kind of wake-up where you're instantly alert, your body tense for no apparent reason. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, the crickets, the occasional owl were gone. It was so quiet that it felt oppressive. I lay there, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing, just the stillness and the faint sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd just woken up during a natural lull in the forest's activity. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I reached for the flashlight I had placed next to my sleeping bag and turned it on. The tent lit up, and I scanned the small space. Everything was as I'd left it. My backpack, my boots, the book I'd been reading earlier. Nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was convincing myself to go back to sleep, I heard it. A faint rustling sound coming from outside the tent. My heart started pounding. Could have been anything, I told myself. A raccoon, a deer, maybe even the wind. But the sound wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps. Someone or something was walking around my campsite. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the tent back into darkness. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. My mind raced. Should I call out? Let them know someone was here? Or should I stay quiet and hope they'd leave? I decided on the latter. If it was an animal, it would eventually lose interest and go away. If it was a person, well, I wasn't ready to confront that possibility yet. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They circled the tent, slow and methodical. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and silent as possible. I could see the faint outline of shadows moving outside the tent, but the moonlight wasn't strong enough to make out any details. Whoever or whatever it was stopped right in front of the tent. I could hear them breathing, heavy and deliberate. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might give me away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then waited some more, just to be sure. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peek outside, there was no one there. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My backpack, which I'd left near the entrance of the tent, was gone. I felt a mix of fear and anger. Someone had been here, someone had taken my stuff. But why? And more importantly, were they still around? I debated packing up and leaving right then and there, but the idea of wandering through the woods in the dark wasn't appealing. I decided to wait until morning. I'd leave at first light. The rest of the night was a blur of half-sleep and paranoia. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining I heard footsteps again. When dawn finally broke, I was out of the tent in minutes, hastily packing up what was left of my gear. I was relieved to see my car still parked where I'd left it. Whoever had taken my backpack hadn't touched it. I drove away, feeling a sense of relief as the campsite faded in my rearview mirror. But the experience stayed with me. Who had been out there? Why had they taken my backpack? And what would have happened if I'd confronted them? I never got the answers to those questions, but I know one thing for sure. I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I always loved camping, but this trip was one I'd never forget, and not in a good way. It started as a spur-of-the-moment decision. I had just gotten a new tent, a high-end model that was supposed to handle any weather. I figured the best way to break it in was a solo weekend in the woods. No distractions, no phone, just me and nature. I picked a remote area in the Adirondacks, a place I'd been to before but never camped. It was deep enough into the wilderness that you wouldn't find crowds, but not so far that I felt completely isolated. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived early Saturday morning. I parked my car, hoisted my pack, and started the hike. The first few hours were perfect. The crisp air, the smell of pine, the crunch of leaves under my boots, everything felt just right. I took my time, stopping to admire the views and snap a few pictures. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot that seemed ideal for camping. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall trees. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a fire. As the sun began to set, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fire crackled softly, and the stream's gentle babbling was the only other sound. I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove, ate slowly, and sipped some coffee as the stars came out. The night sky was incredible, free of light pollution, with the Milky Way stretching across it like a glittering river. It felt like I was the only person in the world. That feeling didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. I lay still, listening. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't hear anything unusual, just the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just a dream or maybe an animal moving around outside. I tried to go back to sleep, but something kept nagging at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. I sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The clearing was empty. The fire's glow barely lit the area, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I felt uneasy. The rest of the night was restless. I'd drift off, only to wake up again, sometimes to a noise I couldn't identify, other times to complete silence. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved. Daylight always makes things better, and I chalked up the night to an overactive imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left my gear at the campsite and followed the stream. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, and I began to relax. I wandered for a couple of hours, occasionally marking trees with a piece of chalk so I wouldn't get lost. Eventually, I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a pile of rocks, neatly stacked, in the middle of a small clearing. At first, I thought it might be some kind of trail marker, but it didn't make sense for it to be here so far off the beaten path. The arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the woods felt very quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. I decided it was time to head back. I followed my chalk marks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look around, but I never saw anything. Still, the sensation was strong, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I got back to the campsite, I noticed something was off. My gear was exactly where I'd left it, but the fire pit looked different. The ashes had been disturbed, scattered around as if someone had kicked them. My first thought was an animal, but there were no tracks, no signs of digging, just the scattered ashes. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy. I tried to enjoy myself, but the sense of being watched lingered. By the time the sun set, I'd made up my mind to leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want to pack up and hike out in the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that staying another night was a bad idea. That night was worse than the first. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't subtle this time. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, circling the tent. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Whoever or whatever it was, they didn't try to get in. They just kept walking around, slow and steady. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, but all I could hear was the stream. I wanted to look outside, but I was too terrified to move. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn began to seep through the fabric of the tent. Then, I finally unzipped it and stepped out. The clearing was empty, but there were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled the tent several times before leading off into the woods. I felt a wave of nausea. Whoever had been out there had been watching me. Maybe they were still watching. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking back to the trailhead. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail was empty. When I finally reached my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I tossed my pack in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints and the stacked rocks. What had I stumbled into out there? A campsite I shouldn't have found? A warning I didn't understand? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. The decision to camp alone in a remote part of the forest seemed like a good idea at the time. I needed some peace, a break from the constant noise of city life, and a chance to clear my head. I'd planned everything down to the smallest detail. I chose a spot about 10 miles into a national park I'd read about online, away from the main trails and any signs of civilization. I packed my gear: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, and a basic map of the area, the essentials for a weekend away. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours. It was early morning, and the weather was perfect, cool and crisp with a clear blue sky. I parked my car in the designated lot, locked it up, and shouldered my pack. The trail was quiet, and I only passed a few other hikers heading in the opposite direction. After about 2 hours of walking, I reached a fork in the trail. One path was well-trodden and marked with signs, but the other was overgrown and barely visible. This was the direction I had planned to take, off the beaten path. The forest grew denser as I made my way deeper into the woods. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight barely filtered through the canopy. I checked my map frequently, ensuring I stayed on course. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearing near a small stream, an ideal spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the sound of the running water was calming. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and set up a small fire pit. Everything felt right. I felt alone but not lonely, just the way I wanted it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated food and sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth. The forest came alive with sounds: the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I reminded myself that this was exactly what I'd come for. The first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, waking only once to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Probably a deer or a raccoon, I thought, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I felt refreshed and ready to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite and ventured further into the woods with just my map, a bottle of water, and a small snack. The terrain was rougher than I expected, with uneven ground and patches of dense underbrush, but the challenge was invigorating. After a few hours of hiking, I stumbled upon something unusual. It was a small, makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves, partially hidden by a thicket. It looked old, like it had been abandoned for years. Curious, I approached it cautiously. Inside, I found remnants of a fire and some rusted tin cans. It didn't seem like a recent campsite, but the sight of it gave me an uneasy feeling. Who had built it and why had they left? I decided not to linger and headed back to my camp. When I returned, the sun was already low in the sky. As I approached my tent, I noticed something odd. The flap was unzipped, even though I was sure I'd closed it before I left. My heart sank. I checked my gear. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the sleeping bag was slightly unrolled, and my food bag was open. It could have been an animal, I told myself, though it didn't seem likely. I tightened the straps on my food bag, zipped up the tent, and started a fire. The unease I'd felt earlier began to creep back in. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside my tent made me jump. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant howling of a coyote, even the occasional crack of a branch had my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard something new, a distinct crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. They were slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell silent again. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, and eventually managed to drift off. The next morning, I found footprints near my campsite. They were human, unmistakably so, and they circled my tent. My stomach churned as I crouched to examine them. They weren't fresh enough to be from last night, but recent enough to make me uneasy. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear quickly, extinguished the fire, and started back toward the trailhead. The hike back was tense. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made me spin around, expecting to see someone there. But the forest was empty, or at least it seemed that way. I pushed myself to move faster, barely stopping for water. The thought of those footprints kept playing in my mind. Who had been near my tent, and why? The overgrown trail felt longer on the way back, and the sun was already sinking when I reached the main path. I was relieved to see other hikers again. The sight of people, even strangers, made me feel safer. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had set completely. I tossed my pack into the car and locked the doors as quickly as I could. Sitting in the driver's seat, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I'd made it out, but as I turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I backed out of the lot and sped down the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I haven't been camping since. The experience left me shaken, and I've spent countless nights replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it just a coincidence? Or had someone been following me the entire time? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. The wilderness isn't as empty as it seems. I've always enjoyed solo camping trips. They give me a sense of freedom that's hard to find in the busy grind of everyday life. I planned this trip meticulously, as always. The location was a remote spot deep in the forest, one that I had read about on a hiking forum. It was supposed to be serene, untouched, and far from the usual trails. perfect for someone like me who wanted a break from the world. The drive to the trailhead took about 4 hours. The last stretch of the road was a narrow dirt path winding through thick woods. It was late afternoon when I parked my car and strapped on my gear. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt the tension of city life begin to melt away as I started walking. The trail was faint but manageable. It meandered through groves of towering pines and patches of dense undergrowth. Occasionally, I would stop to check my GPS, just to make sure I was on course. My destination was a small clearing by a stream, about 7 miles in. It wasn't marked on any official maps, but the forum members swore it was worth the trek. About halfway in, the woods started to feel different. The trees grew closer together, and the air felt cooler. The sunlight barely reached the ground, creating a dim, almost eerie atmosphere. I shrugged it off as just my imagination and pressed on. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. The spot was as beautiful as promised. The stream sparkled in the fading light, and the clearing was surrounded by tall, protective trees. It felt like a hidden sanctuary. I set up my tent near the edge of the stream, careful to leave no trace of my presence. After a quick meal of dehydrated food, I sat by the water and enjoyed the quiet. The only sounds were the babbling stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt at peace, far removed from the chaos of the world. As darkness fell, I retreated to my tent. The temperature dropped quickly, and I was grateful for my warm sleeping bag. I drifted off to sleep easily, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was faint at first, a rhythmic crunching sound, like something walking through the undergrowth. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as I lay there, the sound grew louder, closer. It didn't have the erratic pattern of an animal. It was deliberate, measured. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever or whatever was out there might hear it. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. What if turning it on gave away my position? After a few agonizing minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. The rest of the night was sleepless. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe another camper who had gotten lost and wandered too close. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to stay another night, reasoning that the odds of encountering anyone in such a remote spot were slim. The day passed uneventfully. I explored the area, collected firewood, and even managed to catch a small fish in the stream for dinner. By evening, I felt more relaxed, almost foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. That night, I made sure to secure everything before going to bed. I even placed a few small rocks around my tent, thinking they might alert me if someone or something approached. Despite my precautions, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest. Sometime after midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were more deliberate, circling my tent. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They knew I was here. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped again, just outside the tent. Then, to my horror, I heard the faint sound of breathing. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps moved away. I waited until dawn, clutching my knife, too afraid to sleep. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to my car. Every sound, every shadow, set my nerves on edge. I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. The trail that had seemed so serene just a day before now felt menacing. When I finally reached my car, I was relieved but still on edge. I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods. Back home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a hunter or another camper who hadn't realized how close they were. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whoever was out there had been watching me, studying me. They had waited until the dead of night to approach, knowing how vulnerable I would be. I haven't been camping since. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels like a place of unseen dangers. I still think about that trip, about the footsteps and the breathing outside my tent. I'll probably never know who or what it was, and maybe that's for the best. Some questions are better left unanswered. Camping always seemed like the perfect way to disconnect from the constant hum of life. The emails, the traffic, the buzz of city lights that never seemed to dim. So when I managed to get a 3-day weekend off work, I decided it was time to get back to nature. I found a spot in a remote area of a national forest, a place that promised solitude and untouched beauty. The drive there took longer than I'd expected. The last hour was a narrow dirt road winding through dense trees, with barely enough room for one vehicle. I hadn't seen another car or person for miles. That was the point, though, right? To get away from everyone and everything. The quiet was almost unnerving, but I told myself that was the city talking. I was just out of my element. I arrived mid-afternoon and parked my car at the designated lot. A small clearing with space for maybe 3 vehicles. It was empty. My destination was about 2 miles away, accessible only by foot. I loaded my pack with everything I'd need. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a map. I'd opted to leave my phone behind, figuring it wouldn't have reception anyway. Besides, I wanted to be completely off the grid. The hike to the campsite was beautiful but challenging. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to duck under low branches and push through brambles. Occasionally, I stopped to catch my breath and listen. The forest was alive with sound. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant gurgle of a stream. It was peaceful, but there was an edge to it, a sense that I was a visitor in a place where I didn't quite belong. By the time I reached the site, the sun was already dipping low. The campsite was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It had a fire ring made of stones and enough flat ground to pitch my tent. I set to work quickly, knowing daylight was limited. First, I pitched the tent, making sure it was secure. Then I gathered firewood from the surrounding area and arranged it in the fire ring. By the time I lit the fire, the sky had turned a deep orange, and the air was cooling rapidly. Dinner was simple. A can of chili heated over the fire. As I ate, the forest grew darker, and the sounds around me shifted. The birds quieted, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant snap of a twig. I'd always found it fascinating how alive the forest became at night, but sitting there alone, every sound felt magnified. I reminded myself that it was just wildlife, nothing to worry about. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed this, the quiet, the simplicity. My thoughts drifted, and for a while I felt at ease. But as the fire began to die down, a prickling sensation crept over me. Felt like I was being watched. I glanced around, but the darkness beyond the firelight was impenetrable. Telling myself I was just imagining things, I stoked the fire and stayed up a bit longer before finally retreating to my tent. Inside, I zipped the door shut and crawled into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was how exposed I'd feel. The thin walls of the tent offered no real protection, and every rustle outside seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the wind or small animals, but sleep didn't come easily. I drifted off only to wake up several times, heart pounding, certain I'd heard something outside. Each time, I lay still, listening until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, the forest seemed less intimidating. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the air was crisp and cool. I decided to spend the day exploring. I brought a map of the area, and there was a small lake about a mile from the campsite that I wanted to check out. I packed some snacks and set off, following a faint trail that wound deeper into the forest. The hike was uneventful at first. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but I managed to follow it without much trouble. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me like ancient sentinels. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the underbrush, but it always darted away before I could see what it was. I told myself it was just squirrels or birds. When I reached the lake, it was worth the trek. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the sky and surrounding trees like a mirror. I sat by the shore, eating my snacks and soaking in the view. For the first time since arriving, I felt completely at ease. I even considered taking a swim but decided against it. The water was cold, and I didn't want to risk getting chilled. As I started back to the campsite, the unease returned. It was subtle at first, a sense that something was off. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual rustling and chirping replaced by an almost oppressive silence. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow. About halfway back, I noticed something odd. The trail looked different, less defined. I paused, pulling out the map to double-check my location. Everything seemed correct, but the surroundings didn't feel familiar. I told myself I was overthinking it and kept going, but the farther I went, the more certain I became that I was off course. Panic began to creep in. I'd always prided myself on having a good sense of direction, but now I felt completely disoriented. I stopped to get my bearings, turning in circles as I tried to find something familiar. That's when I noticed it, a faint sound, like footsteps, coming from behind me. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just an animal, I forced myself to keep moving. But the feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I tried to focus on finding the trail, but my thoughts kept circling back to the footsteps. They'd been deliberate, human-like. When I finally stumbled back into the clearing where I'd set up camp, relief washed over me. The sight of the tent and fire ring felt like a lifeline. I quickly built up the fire again, the warmth and light a small comfort against the growing darkness. But the unease didn't fade. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. That night was worse than the first. Every sound outside the tent felt like a threat. At one point, I thought I heard breathing soft and steady, just outside. My heart pounded as I lay there, clutching a small knife I'd brought for cutting rope. I didn't move until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent. In the morning, I decided to cut the trip short. Whatever peace I'd hoped to find here was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. I packed up quickly, constantly glancing at the trees. The hike back to the car felt like a marathon. Every step, I expected to hear those footsteps again, to see someone or something watching me. But the forest remained silent, almost too silent. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, the tension began to ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. Looking back, I still don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was all in my head, the product of isolation and an overactive imagination. Or maybe there was someone out there watching me, following me. Either way, I haven't been camping since. When I planned my solo camping trip to the backcountry of Wyoming, I envisioned peaceful evenings by the fire, the quiet hum of nature, and mornings filled with crisp mountain air. It was late September, just before the first heavy snowfall, and the area I had chosen was remote, exactly what I wanted. I craved solitude, a break from my noisy city life. The journey began as expected. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, and set off into the wilderness. The trail was rugged but manageable, winding through thick pine forests and open meadows dotted with golden autumn leaves. I carried enough supplies for 4 days and had a detailed map of the area. My plan was to hike deep into the backcountry, set up camp near a secluded lake, and spend my days exploring the untouched landscape. By the afternoon of the first day, I reached the lake. It was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding peaks and the bright blue sky. I chose a spot to set up camp on a small rise overlooking the water, far enough from the shoreline to avoid any dampness but close enough to enjoy the view. As I pitched my tent and prepared my gear, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I had been craving. The first night passed uneventfully. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, watched the stars for a while, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept deeply, feeling at ease. The next day, I explored the area around the lake. I followed animal trails through the forest, stumbled upon a small waterfall, and even spotted a herd of deer grazing in a distant meadow. The isolation was invigorating. I felt like the only person on Earth, surrounded by nothing but nature's raw beauty. It was on the second evening that I noticed something strange. As I was cooking dinner, I thought I heard a faint rustling in the trees behind my campsite. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or an animal. But then it happened again, louder this time. I stood still, listening intently. The sound stopped, and the forest fell silent. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing unusual. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I reminded myself that animals were common in this area, and it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. To be cautious, I made sure to store my food in a bear canister and placed it a good distance from my tent. I built a small fire and sat by it for a while, trying to shake off the sense of unease. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was overreacting and went to bed. That night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch black, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined whatever had startled me. Then I heard it again, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was coming from somewhere near my campsite. I froze, straining to hear more. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving closer to my tent. My mouth went dry, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the tent's fabric, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The light revealed nothing but the trees and the empty clearing beyond. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, listening intently. Minutes passed, and the silence stretched on. Finally, I convinced myself that whatever it was had moved on. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I found no signs of disturbance around my campsite. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anyone or anything had been there. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the sense of unease lingered. I decided to stay vigilant but not let my imagination ruin the trip. That day, I ventured farther from camp, exploring a ridge that offered stunning views of the surrounding valleys. I spent hours hiking and taking photos, trying to immerse myself in the experience. By the time I returned to the campsite, it was late afternoon, and the shadows were already growing long. I set about preparing dinner, keeping an eye on the forest around me. As dusk fell, I thought I saw movement in the trees on the far side of the lake. It was just a flicker, something out of the corner of my eye. I stared at the spot but saw nothing. The lake's surface was calm, and the forest was still. But the uneasy feeling from the night before returned, stronger this time. I decided to make a larger fire that night, hoping it would deter any animals or anything else from coming too close. As I sat by the flames, I tried to rationalize my fear. The wilderness was full of noises and shadows, and being alone amplified every sound and movement. I told myself that I was safe and that there was no reason to worry. Still, I kept my flashlight and a knife within arm's reach when I finally crawled into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that startled me. It was the sound of something brushing against my tent. A soft, deliberate sound, like fabric being dragged across the nylon. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the sound moved from one side of the tent to the other. Then it stopped. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I turned it on and shone it around the tent's interior, everything looked normal. I mustered the courage to unzip the door just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint light across the campsite. I couldn't see anything unusual. No movement, no signs of life. But the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, clutching the flashlight, listening for any sound. By the time dawn broke, I had made up my mind to cut the trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the campsite. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something trailing me. But the trail remained empty. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I threw my gear into the back seat, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away from the trailhead that I finally felt a sense of relief. I still don't know what happened during that trip. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by the isolation and the eerie stillness of the wilderness. Or maybe there really was something out there watching me, testing the boundaries of my courage. Whatever the truth, I haven't been back to that part of Wyoming since. The memory of those nights lingers, a reminder that the wilderness holds mysteries we may never fully understand. It started out as a simple idea. I wanted to get away for the weekend, somewhere quiet, somewhere without the constant hum of city life. A camping trip seemed perfect. I chose a spot I had visited once before, years ago with friends, a remote location nestled deep in a national forest. I remembered it being serene and far from any major trails. This time I'd go alone. I thought it would give me time to clear my head. I packed the basics: a tent, a sleeping bag, food for 3 days, and a small stove. My backpack was heavy, but manageable. I had checked the weather forecast, clear skies for the entire weekend. Everything seemed lined up for a peaceful escape. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the kind of long, winding road that eventually empties out into gravel. My car was the only one parked there when I arrived. It made me feel a mix of relief and unease. No one would bother me, but also no one would know I was out here. The hike to the campsite took about 4 hours. The forest was alive with sound. Birds chirping, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The air smelled fresh, a mixture of pine and damp earth. It was a stark contrast to the sterile office air I'd been breathing for months. I felt good, My legs ached by the time I reached the spot I had in mind, a small clearing near a slow-moving stream. The sun was still high enough that I had time to set up camp and gather some firewood before dark. By the time I got the fire going, the temperature had dropped noticeably. I warmed my hands near the flames and ate a quick meal of instant noodles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The cheerful sounds of daytime creatures were replaced by the quieter, more sporadic noises of the night. It wasn't unnerving, not at first. It was just different. I sat by the fire for a while, letting the heat seep into my muscles. My mind wandered as I stared into the flames. I thought about work, about the people I hadn't called in too long, about whether I'd remembered to lock my apartment door. Eventually, the fire burned down to glowing embers, and I decided it was time to sleep. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times to the sound of animals moving in the underbrush, but nothing came close to the tent. Morning came, and with it, the promise of a full day to explore. After a quick breakfast, I set off to wander the surrounding area. I didn't go far, just far enough to feel like I was discovering something new. The forest was dense, and the sunlight struggled to filter through the canopy. I found a few animal tracks near the stream and even spotted a deer in the distance. It was exactly the kind of experience I'd hoped for. Around midday, I returned to camp to eat and rest. As I sat on a fallen log, I noticed something strange. The woods were quieter than they had been earlier. The usual hum of insects and occasional bird calls were absent. It wasn't silent, exactly, but it was subdued. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling lingered. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering more firewood and double-checking my gear. The quiet persisted, and by the time evening rolled around, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Still, I reminded myself that I was alone in the middle of the forest. Of course, it felt strange. I wasn't used to this kind of solitude. That night, I built the fire higher, adding more logs than I had the previous night. I wanted the light and the comfort it brought. I stayed up late, watching the flames dance and listening for any unusual sounds. Nothing happened. When I finally crawled into my tent, I told myself I was being paranoid. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A single, distinct sound that didn't belong. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was close, too close. My eyes shot open, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. The forest was silent again, but the sound had been real. I was sure of it. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer, but deep down I wasn't convinced. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I searched the area around my campsite. I found nothing unusual, no tracks, no signs of anything larger than a squirrel. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I considered packing up and heading back, but part of me felt silly. I'd come out here to escape, to prove to myself that I could handle being alone in the wilderness. Leaving early felt like admitting defeat. I spent the day sticking close to camp. I didn't wander far, and I kept my fire going even during the day. The hours dragged. By evening, I was on edge, jumping at every sound. When night fell, I added even more wood to the fire, determined to keep it blazing until dawn if I had to. The second night was worse. The noises started again, faint at first but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't see anything, no matter how hard I strained my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Person? Something else entirely? I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching a heavy branch I'd pulled from the pile of wood. The footsteps came and went, sometimes stopping for long stretches before starting up again. Each time, they seemed a little closer. When dawn finally broke, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The forest felt oppressive, the trees looming larger than they had before. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. My pack felt heavier than it had on the way in, and every sound made me jump. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw my pack into the trunk and locked myself inside. My hands were still trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. The relief I felt as the engine roared to life was almost enough to bring me to tears. I drove away without looking back, the forest receding in my rearview mirror. Even now, weeks later, I can't fully explain what happened out there. I've told myself it was probably just an animal, that I overreacted, let my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I know that's not true. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. Someone or something was out there, watching me, and that's a thought I can't shake. I didn't think much about it when I first decided to camp alone in the wilderness. It was something I'd wanted to do for years. Being out there, away from the noise and chaos of daily life, seemed like the perfect escape. I packed my gear meticulously, double-checked everything, and drove out early on a crisp Saturday morning in October. The air was cool but not biting, and the leaves were in full display, a fiery mix of reds, oranges, and yellows. I felt ready, even excited. The spot I chose was deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road. It wasn't a well-marked campsite. In fact, I had found it on an old hiking forum. Someone had mentioned it as a hidden gem, a place untouched by the usual crowds. The idea of solitude thrilled me. I wanted to test myself, to prove I could handle being out there alone. The hike to the site took nearly 3 hours. The trail was faint in places, and I had to rely on my map and compass to stay on track. My pack felt heavier with every step, but I told myself it was part of the experience. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The clearing was perfect. There was a small stream nearby, the sound of water trickling over rocks soothing in the quiet. The forest felt alive but peaceful, the kind of place that made you breathe a little deeper. I set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find and started a small fire. As the light faded, I cooked a simple meal over the flames and leaned back against a fallen log to eat. The stars began to peek through the canopy above, more of them than I'd ever seen before. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that makes you feel small but in a good way. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was calming. I stayed up later than I'd planned, reluctant to leave the warmth of the fire, but eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and I fell asleep quickly, feeling safe and content. The first night passed without incident. I woke up with the sunrise, feeling refreshed. After breakfast, I spent the day exploring the area. I followed the stream upstream for a while, finding small waterfalls and pools. I climbed a rocky outcrop and sat for a while, taking in the view. The forest stretched out endlessly, a sea of color. It was everything I'd hoped for. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already sinking again. I gathered more firewood, enough to last the night, and settled in for another evening by the fire. As the night deepened, I noticed the forest felt different. The sounds were still there, but they seemed off. The rustling in the bushes sounded closer, the cracks of branches sharper. I told myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods could play tricks on your mind. I went to bed earlier that night, wanting to shake the unease I felt. Sleep didn't come as easily, though. Every little sound outside the tent seemed magnified. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. My heart raced. I froze, straining to hear more. Came again, closer this time. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my flashlight, every muscle in my body tense. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I considered packing up and heading back, but I convinced myself to stay. I come all this way after all. Besides, I told myself it was probably just a bear or a coyote. Nothing to be afraid of if I kept my food secured and stayed cautious. The third day was uneventful. I stayed closer to camp, not wanting to venture too far after the previous night. The forest felt quiet again, almost normal. I gathered more wood, cooked my meals, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But as the sun dipped lower, that feeling of unease returned. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the forest itself was watching me. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep early. I stayed by the fire, feeding it more wood than necessary, the light and warmth comforting. Around midnight, I heard it again, the growl. This time, it was unmistakably close. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees, but the beam didn't reveal anything. The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed, the only sound I could hear. And then, a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but something heavier. Human? Couldn't tell. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood up, holding the flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, scanning the darkness, every nerve on edge. Nothing happened. No more sounds, no movement. Eventually, I convinced myself to sit back down, though I didn't take my eyes off the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back was grueling. My pack felt heavier than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, but I didn't hear anything unusual. Still, I couldn't relax. My nerves were shot, and every shadow seemed like a threat. It wasn't until I reached my car that I finally felt safe. I threw my gear into the trunk and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I looked back toward the trailhead. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the trees. A shadow, maybe, or just my imagination. I didn't wait to find out. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened out there. I've gone over it in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe someone was messing with me. But the feeling I had, that primal fear, is something I'll never forget. It's made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. I've always felt at home in the woods, but now, I'm not so sure. There's a part of me that wants to go back, to prove to myself that I can handle it. But another part, the part that remembers that growl and those footsteps, isn't so sure I ever will. I had been planning the trip for months. A solo camping adventure deep in the woods was just what I needed to escape the routine of everyday life. I picked a remote spot about 3 hours from the nearest town, somewhere I was sure I wouldn't encounter anyone else. I wanted solitude, the kind you could only find in the wilderness. The drive out was uneventful. I passed small towns, winding roads, and endless stretches of trees. The last hour of the journey was on a dirt road that seemed forgotten by time. My car's tires kicked up dust, and the sound of gravel crunching beneath them was the only thing breaking the silence. Finally, I arrived at the trailhead. It was nothing more than a small clearing with a faded wooden sign marking the start of the trail. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my gear, and set off. The hike to the campsite was challenging but rewarding. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The trail twisted and turned through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of distant mountains. I had mapped out a spot near a small, secluded lake. It was a good 5 miles from the trailhead and well off the beaten path. When I finally arrived, it was everything I had hoped for. The lake's surface was like glass, reflecting the towering trees and the sky above. There wasn't a single sign of human presence. It felt like I had stumbled into another world. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground a few yards from the water. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on my campsite. I unpacked my gear, arranged my supplies, and built a small fire pit using stones from the lakeshore. By the time I had everything set up, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Dinner was a simple affair. I heated up a can of soup over the fire and ate while listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds called out to one another, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. As the daylight faded, the forest came alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful in a way that I hadn't experienced in years. When darkness fell, I retreated to my tent. I had brought a book to read, but I found myself too tired to concentrate. The hike had taken more out of me than I realized. I slipped into my sleeping bag and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. I don't know what woke me up. It was sometime in the middle of the night, and the forest was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural. I lay still, straining to hear something, anything. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other harmless animal. But the sound didn't stop. It moved closer, slow and deliberate. I reached for the flashlight I had left by my side and switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent. I could see the silhouette of something just outside, outlined against the fabric of the tent. It was tall, much taller than any animal I'd expect to find out here. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved away. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, until I couldn't hear anything else. Then I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The campsite was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I shone my flashlight around, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching a camping knife and listening for any sounds. None came. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to put some distance between me and whatever had been outside my tent. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves made me whip around, expecting to see someone there. But there was never anything, just the empty forest. About halfway back, I came across something that made my blood run cold. On the trail ahead of me, there were footprints. They were fresh and clearly human. But what unnerved me was the direction they were heading. They were coming from the trailhead the same way I was going. Someone had been walking toward my campsite, and judging by the size of the prints, It was the same person who had stood outside my tent. Quickened my pace, my mind racing. Why would someone be out here this far from civilization? There was no reason to take this trail unless you were deliberately trying to find someone. The thought made my skin crawl. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat. The trailhead was as empty as when I had left it. No other cars, no signs of anyone else. I threw my backpack into the trunk and started the engine, eager to leave. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. I never found out who or what it was that visited my campsite that night, but the experience left a mark on me. I've always loved the outdoors, but now I'm more cautious. I stick to well-traveled trails and campsites where I know there will be other people around. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes the scariest things aren't the animals or the elements. It's the people you don't expect to find out there.